All right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the stream. My name is Rami. Hello, Fanos.
Hi, everyone.
So, thank you all for joining, whoever is here. Actually, if there's anyone want to comment in the chat, just to give us a sign that someone is here, just to be sure. Uh, we know everything is set up, so this is definitely going on. So, where are you chatting from, Fanos?
So I am based in Zurich. I'm currently sitting in a little meeting room at my office, but yeah, in Switzerland. You're
Very
based in
nice.
Texas, right?
Yep, all the way in Austin here. So we have a few hours apart between us, but thankfully, the internet brings us together. Uh,
Just
very nice.
the internet
Uh,
and talking about data in the industry.
yeah, I mean, there is a lot of it, that's for sure. I mean, we're definitely not going to cover everything in this conversation. And the goal is not to either. I mean, we're just going to explore and really just kind of pick on things that are relatively relevant today, right? I mean, there's just a lot going on with like how systems are being developed and how we're looking at, take this from here, process this and that, but then everyone is working in their own ways, and then what's possible is something, what someone is doing is something else, and then many times they overlap. And yeah, it's definitely something we'll look through more and so today. Um, Let's start screen sharing here. We have the goal for everyone, just so everyone is on the same page. Essentially, we'll be talking about, a little bit about what we do and the things that we're working on. And we're gonna cover, quite a bit to do with, what does material discovery actually mean? There are so many things that relate to it, and in our case, we're actually gonna look at it more from like the energy side a little bit. So there's a little teaser there into what we'll go into. But yeah, let's go ahead and shift the screens here. And so here we are. This is the event, so everyone knows we're in the right place here. Um, let's kind of see what the agenda is for us, Fanos.
Sure. Okay, so yeah, the whole point of this webinar, and we've been talking with Rami for quite a bit of time about the topic of data and how it enables or blocks sometimes processes in our industry. What we wanted to do is just have a bit of an open conversation around something that allows us to give a practical example of where data is either an enabler or a blocking point. And what you see on the screen is the rough structure of what we're going to follow. I think we both said we're just going to see how the conversation evolves. We're just going to do a bit of an intro of ourselves and then what each of our companies do. Um, then I'll talk a little bit about what sustainability is within the architecture, engineering, and construction space. And then we'll sort of dive into two closely related topics, but still different. So one is energy of buildings, which is kind of the original topic when we were talking about sustainability in the past. And then we'll also talk about embodied impact. So everything that relates to materials and more material related impacts. And then in both of these topics, um, the idea is to give a few examples of what we see happening and what are some interesting kind of challenges, and to sort of make ourselves think about is relevant and could solve some of these issues, and then also talk about where discovery tools like, for example, what we do at 2050 Materials could actually help. And then at the end, if we have time and if there are any questions, we're also happy to kind of open it up to the audience for any questions and to invite anyone who might want to, you know, um, start a conversation about a different topic to let us know.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, at the end, in many ways, this is more a conversation than it is a presentation, but we're using things as visual aid. So for the most part, yeah, that's generally the
Yeah.
flow. Well, this is awesome. Let's get into it here then. Um, Fanas, want to start presenting yourself? Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. So yeah, my name is Fanos. I am an environmental engineer by background, but I always focused on data and kind of data modeling. So in the space of environmental assessments, I've done a lot of work with life cycle assessments, which is essentially carbon accounting for different sort of systems. And I worked for a few years in the financial sector where I was helping investors assess climate risks and opportunities. And then a few years ago, I started um, a company called 2050 Materials, where essentially it's all about helping the industry, the built environment, basically get access to sustainability data. And we have a strong focus on materials, but we also cover other types of data. It's a bit of a summary, and then I think I'll talk also a little bit more about what we do at 2050 once you
Yeah,
present.
yeah, absolutely. Yep, and that's very interesting. I mean, that's kind of seems like it's a good emergence between the world of finance and the environment, right? And in many ways, it's overlapped quite significantly over the years. So that's very exciting. Um, my background actually is a little bit less, let's say, traditional in many ways for even why it is in the AEC industry. But formerly, it's more on the software engineering side, which pivoted rather quickly into user experience, simply because as much as I kind of understood, the mechanics and just the engineering side, right, of what it makes to or what leads to developing anything we do on computers, uh, answering why we do something and why we do it and however way we do it to be more important. And so I found it very interesting that, as you learn to build software, as you learn to understand how systems work with each other, the fundamentals of why someone wants to do something is ultimately the most important. So that's the one thing that I've focused on quite a bit. And generally speaking, the career development path that I've chosen to take is a rather unstructured one in many ways. And I simply just focused on things that I thought were relevant in the world and are interesting. And so the world of AEC seemed very interesting from the context of both how technology can apply, but then also all the innovations and exciting things happening there. And so, just to kind of give some focus on like the kinds of exposure I've had is that I focus very much on the role design has and how it really leads projects as it evolves from, let's say, early phases, whether it's a new build or an existing structure, you always go back to the fundamental of a design question of some kind. And so I found that area to be most interesting and have focused over the years in the many ways in which we design buildings, both through technology, but then also through people, right? And the conversations that we have with all the clients, stakeholders involved, and things like that. So yeah, it's relatively very interesting and kind of been in many sort of areas. So lots to learn still, I think. So I'm very excited for what's ahead. In terms of maybe segueing here into the things that we do, so method and build, that kind of happened through various pivots in some ways, but essentially the real story about it is as I was learning more about design, as I was learning more about what it takes to understand why you're building something the way you are, and then knowing how it will actually all come together, I realized this fragmentation that really exists in between how those who are innovating in their products and those who are designing buildings have this cohesiveness that needs to exist. And the many mechanisms that we have to enable that over time just vary. And so, what I found as I was focused from a climate lens as I approached all this and looking into like what does it mean to decarbonize, I've seen a lot of innovation in the material science, particularly, and how we're actually innovating on the composition of the products that we're using to build with to begin with. And so that whole area made me realize that any company today that tries to commercialize in this very dynamic world of building product procurement or discovery and things like that to be very wide. And so from that standpoint, and then talking to many manufacturers, especially early stage ones as they're going through their testing and certifications and things of the like, that there's some missing pieces in how they can commercialize. And that's one thing I'm trying to essentially continue to validate in some ways, and how this really enables a better transition for someone to take their data, their product information, and put them into this digital world that's ever growing, and making it easier to really work with you know manufacturers and anyone involved with building anything.
Great.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of 2050, Fanos, tell us,
Yeah,
because
very
yeah,
briefly, I mentioned earlier what we focus on, which is essentially enabling access to climate data to everyone in the industry. And this graphic kind of shows a little bit, what we're doing and building towards, and a little bit our vision for the future. So um, the reason we haven't built a software which does a specific set of things is because the built environment is quite complicated and involves many stakeholders, and each stakeholder sort of needs to follow a different process for what I would call their typical work, and then they now usually need to follow a different process to account for the sustainability impacts of whatever their work does. So what we think the solution to that is not 15 new sustainability and carbon tools that are each customized to a workflow of a stakeholder in the industry, but rather finding ways to have sustainability and climate data flow into existing workflows of these users. And um, we're talking about a lot of, let's say, relatively complicated data work. So extracting data from PDFs and structuring it into a database and building APIs. And we don't think that every single engineer and consultant and architect will set up their own APIs. So we sort of take that as our role to the industry to offer one uniform data set that can be used in theory by anyone. And what you see on the right side of the graphic is a little bit the outcome of our work up to now. Power BI dashboards to Revit plugins or any other plugin within an existing design software. There's integrations of the data within procurement systems. So there's really cool applications of all of this data, which honestly, if you asked me a couple of years ago what they would be, I wouldn't have been able to guess. But
right.
it's very much aligned with what we wanted to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can just move to the next slide.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, maybe just a small, like a short word on how we actually collect this data. It's a lot of it is publicly available, which often makes our customers come to us and ask us, okay, why would I not just collect it myself? And what we say is, by all means, like feel free to do that if you like. But what you end up understanding once you try to do that is it takes a lot of data maintenance work. It takes a lot of structuring. It takes a lot of data enrichment. So we strongly believe and try to show to the industry that we all benefit by one player doing this, or maybe by a couple of players doing this, rather than by every single stakeholder trying to capture open data sets and structure it into a bigger data set. So that's kind of why we had this slide. But
Mm-hmm.
I think we can maybe proceed to yeah, maybe the topic of, sustainability. We talk a lot about sustainability and climate.
Yep.
It would be interesting to define what that means in the built environment. Um, I don't know if you agree or not, Rami, but I sort of have these three buckets in my head of what is the core things that people think about, at least when we talk about sustainability. And I
Mm-hmm.
know this is a non-exhaustive list, so I'm curious, I'll run through these three buckets and then you can tell me a little bit, if I missed any.
Sure.
Um, so the very first thing is how much energy is our building or our project using? And this has been, as I said earlier, kind of the classic topic that we think about when we mention sustainability, because we typically need to pay for gas or oil or some form of electricity to power our building. And in terms of emissions or in terms of direct climate change impact, this is what we call operational emissions. And it's a huge chunk of buildings, of building impacts, I mean. And then this is a topic where there's essentially two approaches to reduce it, very roughly speaking. And I know you'll dive into the topic a bit more, Rami, but you can either make the electricity that's being used be better from a climate point of view. So it can be renewable energy, for example,
Yep.
or you can make your building require less energy. So if you have a very well insulated building, you need to heat it up or cool it down a lot less than if you have, let's say, an older building with a lot of like a lot less insulation.
Yeah. Yeah, and primarily there, I mean, the biggest consideration too is that like the paradigm of what buildings we're talking about makes a big difference on how this
Yeah.
conversation will even go. So whether we're talking about something that maybe has been recently developed and or something that's older in some ways, even then like there might be reasons for why certain things were done a certain way. But with climate change, for example, we notice that if we want to achieve the same level of comfort, there's some modifications that need to be done there. But yeah, particularly we're talking about energy. As I was learning even more about, what does it mean to be sustainable in this context, and carbon emissions is just one part of the picture, but somehow everything ties to that because ultimately anything that has to do with some kind of production has to do some kind of process that might impact the emissions variable. And so when we consider that buildings themselves, they actually eat up 30% of the energy that we use in terms of all the energy that's used in the world. So that's quite a good chunk of the energy we demand
Yes.
essentially. And so that's where the puzzle becomes a lot more interesting in some ways. And so just if we're to look through a little bit more, what actually drives change then? So do we is our goal to get that number lower? Probably. For many reasons, but financially too, right? I mean, you even talked about, how you were involved in finance. At the end of the day, like energy is a cost for either the owner, operator, or the tenants, right? If we're looking at it from different standpoints. But ultimately, what could drive change are many things. And for the sake of this conversation, it's more so about just kind of highlighting, in some ways, the obvious. But if something is failing, that will imminently cause some replacement procedure that gives an opportunity to consider, okay, what can we do now, given also how maybe the energy system in that building was designed. So that's another component too, or how you can adapt to it. Investment opportunities. So I think this is one that's been happening a lot more lately. You have incentives and government programs, for example, that offset the upfront cost of investing in better energy systems or energy efficient, let's say HVAC systems, right? Heating and cooling, or your regulation. And we'll dive into some of these in a little bit. I wanted to share a few things though. So this is not going to be all about slides and graphs and things like that, but I just thought this was a very interesting from a very reputable agency where they study a lot of this. And for anyone interested, IEA is actually offering a lot of this data for free. So their platform is very accessible, and it's valid research data that's available. And in this case, if we look at just what it takes for us to heat buildings, the numbers were, to me at least, surprising in some ways, right? Obviously, it's cyclical when we need to heat a space, but even then, that still happens, right, year round. And so it's very interesting to see sort of how over the past years, at least, the number has grown higher somewhat. But the projection is that as we try to improve and invest in more energy efficient solutions or better design and renovation in terms of energy performance structure, those can go a lot lower. Passive house is probably one of the better examples out there. Not to mention how also the type of heating system you're using can impact this significantly. But to leave this off at a note, what I think is very interesting is that the projection for what will really lead to this reduction consists of both the energy efficiency, as mentioned earlier, of whatever the system or product is that we're using, but also behavioral. So we've seen some of that. Like, for example, I live in Austin, right? Just 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, didn't COVID make history for us? What the last few years actually were, right? We forget. But essentially, we had a winter storm that was in some ways unprecedented, but it led to outages. And a big factor to that isn't necessarily that, let's say, the energy grid and the supply is inadequate. In fact, it was just the fact that everyone was just cranking up their heat. So, there is this interconnection that doesn't exist in terms of, do we know at a very wide scale how much someone is setting their thermostat to because they want to be comfortable, and as a result, in that case, it just put too much demand and it wasn't able to keep up. So the fortunate thing here is for anyone around hospitals or infrastructure buildings that require consistent grid, those were prioritized. But otherwise, yeah, behavioral change in that situation, for example, could have avoided it, for example, right? So I think that's very interesting in that sense. But ultimately, it kind of goes back to, we're talking about energy. The goal here is also I'm coming in as an observer, so I'm basically trying to maybe consider how should we look at this, or maybe what are the kinds of questions we should consider. And again, I think ultimately things go back to the design. And so what's interesting here, you mentioned about buildings in terms of their energy generation and things like that. What's interesting now is can owners, for example, consider how their buildings can generate more energy than they consume? And then you have new economical opportunities in terms of how does that energy get supplied back to the grid? How is it reinvested in maybe storage solutions, right? Or the design of the energy flow, essentially. How are cities engaging with things? So I think everything is a conversation. There is no point solution to everything in that regards. It all comes back into a context of where are you, what are things happening to really leverage it. So that ultimately, it's in very many ways it's a collaboration. And obviously, the energy efficient products that are becoming more and more available and in some ways affordable and the various mechanisms. But to touch briefly on regulation, what I think is interesting here is the approach that some are taking in terms of how do we even start assessing this? Because at least in the US, and this is where it gets interesting between US and Europe in terms of bureaucracy and regulations and enforcement, it's like there is somewhat of a different culture attitude too to how they're being perceived, right? And so what's interesting in the US, for example, in a lot of cities where there are sustainability goals in terms of how they look at the just reduction in emissions or achieving net zero. What's interesting here is that the approach is baby steps into encouraging something, right? It's not about something sudden and very expensive, but it's more so, okay, in these first years, for example, if you look at New York City or Boston, for example, they've developed programs where they'll start monitoring your energy use, and depending on the size of your building, the regulations come into play in the form of if you're using this much energy on a yearly basis, the goal is to get it to a certain reduction. If you don't comply, there is potentially a fine, or your records end up being, to where it's like you're not in good standing in some ways. So there are more subtle ways, there are more direct ways from a financial perspective. Um, the joke might be, oh, well, that's just a new cost. But in reality, it's a lot more to do with how it encourages a different perspective and look at things. And as a result, these have been in practice for a few years now, and it's actually drove interest into even seeing what's out there. So, in many ways, it's a shakeup more than it is a mandate for someone to just care more that, hey, this could be better. There are things out there that can improve. So it's very interesting. But we're talking about emissions, and that's one thing about us talking about carbon data. So what I think is very interesting here is that at the end of the day, there is a scientific approach, right? This is not just a guess that, we come up with numbers out of thin air. There is a process to things, and this is where a lot of development is still ongoing with a lot of progress that's been very, let's say, amazing in many ways of how it's been iterated. This is a resource by a group, Carbon Leadership Forum, which is they're a very reputable and leading agency in this topic. And all I'm really wanting to share here is that for anyone who's not already familiar, in our audience, probably quite a few already are, but the scientific approach essentially comes down to giving structure to what we measure, right? We can't improve what we can't measure. And so eventually the idea is that we go into LCA data, which is life cycle assessments or life cycle analyses, and we look into, how exactly is it that we make something? How do we know how much energy was used to produce it? Everything that goes in between, supplying it from one place to the other. All these things can become pretty complex, but for anyone interested, the technology available today is making a lot of these a lot easier. It's just a matter of paying attention to what they are and actually using them. But it's becoming very exciting to where we can start measuring more realistically with what's really happening instead of guessing. So I think this is a very good segue into what you want to talk about as well, environmental product declarations, right? So
Yeah,
they all tie together. The data comes from somewhere, and then no one wants to sit through and read, hundreds of pages. Sure, we have ChatGPT now, which obviously anyone who's realized the potential that we can do with AI now, you can, yes, parse documents and make them a lot easier. And there's a very good intersection there between actually how AI is playing a role too. But yeah, tell us a little bit more. So, like, how does EPD get into the picture, and what are you seeing there?
sure. Yeah. So maybe for anyone who might not be familiar with the acronym EPD, so um, what Rami was just talking about was a lot around the energy of buildings, and if we try to simplify sustainability impacts, I would say the simplest metric to look at is our carbon emissions. So contribution to greenhouse gas emissions that essentially cause climate change. And when it comes to energy, we count the emissions that are created to generate that energy, whether that's heating or electricity for lighting or anything like that. Now, on the material side of things, we still try to calculate the carbon footprint of the associated materials. And the carbon footprint there, in that case, comes from the actual production of the product. So if we're thinking about a single brick, for example, and we want to know the carbon
Mm-hmm.
footprint of a brick, what we're trying to really calculate is, you know, what are the raw materials of the bricks? How were they extracted? How were they transported to a brick factory, and then what kind of energy, electricity, whatever energy was used to actually manufacture the brick, and then how was that transported to the site. So you can
Mm-hmm.
think of it like everything that happened in, yeah, that's a good slide to actually show. So everything that happened during these stages A1 to A5 until it arrives on the construction site.
Mm-hmm.
Now, environmental product declarations essentially try to give some insight on exactly this topic. So they break down the life cycle stages of materials and they say, we're going to estimate or calculate, depending on how much data is available, uh, the environmental impacts of this specific product. And then from a practicality point of view, what that means or why that exists is if I'm an architect and I'm thinking about what materials to specify for my design of a new, let's say, residential project I'm working on, what I really want to understand is how does, for example, a brick wall compare to a concrete wall, compare to a timber stud wall, or an aerated brick wall, and I want to understand the basic differences between those materials. But then, even when I choose a material, I want to understand, okay, if I source from brick manufacturer A versus brick manufacturer B, are there any differences? Is one of them better from an impact point of view? And it's very interesting because in some categories, there is a large variation between manufacturers. So even if you end up picking a specific product, which let's say is not the best or the most sustainable material, you can still pick a much better um, product in the market compared to the average just by having access to that kind of data.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and the idea of EPDs is it's essentially this calculation process, but there is a framework around it so that it follows a certain standard and so that we can hopefully trust them to a big extent. So it's a lot about, having third-party verifications and following a specific standard. Specifically, it's EN 15804, typically that we reference. Um, Now, the very interesting thing about the regulations around this space is that there is existing standards and there's consensus in the industry around what should be reported. Um, there aren't very concrete regulations as to every manufacturer needing to have an EPD for every product. And that's probably a good thing up to now because it's been relatively expensive to generate EPDs.
Yeah.
But as there's evolving regulations, especially in Europe, there is this construction products regulation which doesn't enforce EPDs, but it enforces essentially the same outcome. So having the availability of this data for multiple types of products. And I think this is helping the industry as a whole because it's forcing us to figure out ways to generate this kind of data more efficiently, more cheaply. So there is, generally speaking, a very big trend and movement towards an expansion of either EPDs or other assessments that provide similar data, like the carbon footprint of products.
Mm-hmm. And
Um, and I mean, maybe to go back to what we do at 2050 Materials, a lot of our data comes actually from EPDs,
mm-hmm.
and they are hugely insightful. And sorry, maybe let's stay on that side for a second still.
Sure.
So they're hugely insightful as documents, but they are also very, very complicated, if I'm being honest. So
Yeah.
I am technically speaking, I'm a specialist in the life cycle assessment domain, which means I should be able to understand the ins and outs of EPDs or similar documents.
Mm-hmm.
And even having worked in this space for a while, it's very confusing to open a PDF document that has, 25 pages sometimes describing what assumptions were used and what data points were utilized and what the outcome was. So a lot
Yeah.
of what we think needs to happen is let's figure out which data points are actually relevant for the industry and then only provide those. So sort of minimize the complexity to the extent possible.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you have any kind of your own experience with EPDs. I know you've looked into EPDs as well, Rami.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for one, I'm definitely familiar with these standards. Because at the end, even in my, let's say, my analytical perspective into looking into this, right, and understanding like what is it that we measure, and ultimately, to your point, I think it's very important that having this practical approach of okay, what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and how do we, enable that to happen a lot easier. But to your point about, getting EPDs being expensive, what's very interesting about that is that it's an emerging field. And what's nice now is that as we look more and more into implementing technology in the areas of how do we monitor the behavior or the manufacturing process, how do we monitor and analyze, even the raw material extraction at that point, everything can be quantified given good judgment and just given attention. I think it's the fact that this never really got that much attention. So the systems to enable easier monitoring were never deployed. So just like
Hmm.
anything, and in the infancy of something, it's going to be expensive at first, just because it just takes more manpower, literally. Manpower, woman power, human power.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way. And so it's essentially a thing to do here, where, in my observation at least, the costs for EPDs have made it a very big barrier for the wider market to adopt. And in some ways, even seeing right now conversations where distrust towards EPDs is starting to become a little bit more of a question too. And
Yeah.
not because of necessarily bad practice, but you have to give everyone benefit of doubt, and like the realization that to getting the most accurate data is very, like, not only time consuming but can be very expensive. And so it's only a matter of time as we look more into okay, how can some kind of function, some kind of process help us monitor this easier. And it's only a matter of time until we start seeing better systems monitoring this data, so that ultimately becomes a lot easier. But what
Yeah.
I what I would really leave it at is that at the end of the day, this isn't about monitoring data for the purpose of emissions. What I'm finding very interesting is that those invested in doing it today are actually looking at it as this is an opportunity for us to understand where we have gaps or opportunities in our manufacturing process to make things a lot
Totally.
more cost efficient, or how we can reduce some kind of component. So, in many ways, actually, this process is fundamentally just a better way of operating. And it's a consequence of it that, hey, you can now actually, report better or more accurate carbon emissions as a result. But really, the bottom line impact is you're more efficient in understanding how you do something, and you can objectively address anything that looks like it could be improved. And no one has to point fingers, so it's there,
Mhm.
and everyone can take the responsibility together. So it's not a matter of who's to blame. So I think that's the biggest thing there that I've observed that I think is where we could focus a lot more for sure.
Yeah. Maybe as a closing point from my side on this
Yeah,
kind of slide, I agree with you completely. I think the goal should not be um, short-sighted in the sense that the goal is not really to be able to just look at the carbon figure. Like the carbon figure means almost nothing in reality. The goal is to try to do better. So to try to reduce, and we're seeing this in some markets where we have carbon budgets that are reducing every year on buildings. So
yeah,
these EPDs or other data points that talk about, carbon figures, what they're meant to do is they're meant to help you design in a way that lowers the climate impact of the buildings. And I think this is a good transition into it's a very clear example for me of where data can have a real positive impact, both in terms of helping you comply with a regulation, for example, in this case,
yeah,
or helping you just design better. And better can mean all kinds of things.
sure.
And I think this is a very nice segue actually into what does this actually mean for the manufacturers and what does it mean for if I'm a brick manufacturer, since we spoke about bricks, I probably will need to start providing all kinds of information and all kinds of data to the architects and the engineers that I've been working with because they are pressured by their own customers to provide it or to have access to it. And what this graphic kind of says is I can either do it the traditional way, let's say, where I store all of these documents on my website and I maybe email them or discuss them over a phone with my customer. But
Mm-hmm.
that means that I'm creating a relatively big amount of barriers to my customer until they get the data. And in a world where we're all getting more accustomed with being productive and being quick with what we want answers as soon as possible, I think there's a very good argument to be made about being supplier C in this specific image where you provide your data through a platform. You don't necessarily need or you're not forcing your customer to pick up the phone or send you an email or dig through your website to find the right data point, but rather you let them use this data within their workflow and then just trust the fact that by providing a better customer experience, you're actually also winning their trust and their willingness
Mm-hmm.
to work with you.
Yeah.
At least that's how I see it. I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's accustomed to, how we search for something or how we want to retrieve information. I think context matters here. I've talked enough and also been in some ways exposed to, understand that the flow of how someone approaches their project, there can sometimes be a somewhat of a disconnect in terms of this is what the technology can really do at its fullest potential, but in reality, the operational structure or the operational flow for how a team does something might still make some things feel like, okay, but my resistance to, change is not that there's a resistance. I'm just used to doing something a certain way. And so the beauty is that even with like what you've done with your platform and all the other platforms that are being developed right now, harnessing on this whole point of like data being shared, is that it's all about the experience you're enabling so that friction becomes a lot lower. But I think in the context of design, like for a manufacturer, the peace of mind they need to have is not that it's about chasing every client they possibly can, but what this is really enabling is that you're now, if you're at its best providing the best data you can about your product to the internet, right, or to the world of systems, you're essentially allowing people to get in touch with you when they're in the middle of making a decision. And that is the time you want to talk to them anyway. Like, that is
Mm,
the best time, like, in terms of the cycle of, say, someone reaching out to someone about a product they could consider in their project, whether it's a current or future project. the beauty here is that all these systems, what they're really trying to lead to is let everyone have their freedom of movement, if you will, in discovering the things that might apply to their projects. But then they can get in touch with your team, the manufacturing team, right? And those who are selling these products are informing, because they're the experts at the end of the day about what they are. So whether they use a combination of, computer systems to enable product information, and then at the end you still want to talk to someone more often than not, in some ways, right? That will still happen. And so the idea is that you're now enabling a better way for people to talk to you at a time where they're really in the middle of making a decision. And so I think for any manufacturer, that's a great thing, because now say you have a team of people who are responsible in getting clients and getting projects. You can now basically increase your ratio of spending time on those who are in the middle of their projects, versus those who are in a completely different phase, and they might even forget about you by the time they're in the middle of their project, right? So I feel like there's this whole chase thing, but at the end of the day, it just comes down to the context and the state of mind the other person is in, so you can talk to them in a way where it makes sense. And that's I think the beauty in all this data sharing, right? Is that we can enable more of these opportunities, and pretty much everyone wins, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's, the message, maybe as we wrap up is, as a manufacturer, there are ways to simplify your life in this changing environment. And I think there is a bunch of really motivated teams that are really experienced with working with data, providing that data. We each have our focus, I would say, and it's sometimes tempting, especially if you're a bigger manufacturer, to focus on, building it yourself or gathering all of the data that you might need in the future yourself. But at least it's my strong opinion that platforms have a really good role in this phase of the industry, and I think there's a lot that can be gained from a manufacturer when they take the effort and onboard their products, their product information onto a platform, because that opens up avenues. And if nothing else, it gets you accustomed with the concept of managing data, which, let's admit
Yeah.
it, it's not something that manufacturers have had to do, at least to the extent that we need to do it today, for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to your point here, you're mentioning about putting their data on, and let's say people having to dig through websites, right, and things like that. Like there are, some platforms that have taken on that role, and they're like, okay, we're gonna aggregate everything in our platform and things like that. But at the end of the day, a manufacturer's website is still important, right? Because what I've observed over the years too is that the direct to manufacturer pipeline for how a product is being discovered but then also procured becomes a very interesting conversation now, because the manufacturer can start winning some of the margins that they would have otherwise lost, because their lead generation or customers come through different pipelines that all have their incentives. And so it becomes very interesting now, can manufacturers start owning more of their clients or projects where their margins are higher, simply put because of how they got discovered. And I think I somewhat feel, uh, I don't know, I feel the need to kind of share something I've also learned recently here. For anyone using AI search, for example, websites are all about SEOs, right? Search engine optimizations. But that whole playbook is irrelevant in the world of how AI search happens and the LLM SO, which are the large language models search optimization functions. And it becomes very interesting there, where what I find interesting is that there is a good overlap in the fact that to actually get better results for an AI to identify your product as a solution for what someone might be asking, maybe a question of, what is a low emissions carbon, let's say glazing product, right? And so you sometimes don't know that people might not be using platforms, because there are people in all sorts of cycles and knowledge of what they could look through. So they might resort to some AI potentially to search for things. And so it's still a very valid channel to pay attention, that it's not just about exclusivity and platforms, but it's also about the whole AI search and web search in general. And so what's very interesting there is that there are ways we can prepare for that, but my point being is that it still overlaps with the core function, that to get better, let's say AI search results that might get your product position, it comes back down to the content you have about your product, positioning it in context that makes sense to say an architect is different than the person who might be installing it. Like they're completely, even though the information in many ways overlaps too, because the architect sometimes needs to know how something is installed in many ways, right? But I think that's what I find very interesting as I learn more and talk to quite a few is that the role of the architect has, even though it was already, very overbooked to say the least, there is now this potential where they can really dig into the means and methods of their designs and what they're specifying. And I think that becomes very interesting. And with all this technology, it kind of lowers how much time they need to spend to get the same result. So I think that's what's very interesting there for sure, in terms
Mm.
of that.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Great.
yeah.
I don't know if
So
there's any questions. I see that there's a few people online, but maybe we can spend the
yeah,
last few minutes kind of opening up for questions.
I mean, by the time we get some questions, potentially, um, would be interesting. There was one more slide here. I mean, tell me a little bit more about like, or tell us like the discovery tools in that sense. Like we talked about it quite a bit, but like share how with your platform because it's grown significantly over the years, and so there's some success there in terms of how these tools are actually working. So what are some like highlights you've seen where like there is a pure benefit here that's become a norm for someone to use now that they can do this.
There's kind of two things I can think of. So one example is on the manufacturer side, and one is on the designer side. And on the manufacturer side, a very clear example is um, especially for manufacturers which are, let's say they have in the range of 50 to 100 SKUs of products. So they've got a digestible amount of data, but it's still a lot for them to manage when it comes to,
Yeah,
making sales outreach or talking to their customers.
yeah,
One really kind of successful case study that we've had is you you've done the effort of verifying and certifying your products, and now you have all of these documents. And then for a small investment, you can onboard all of that data onto the platform that we built on 2050 Materials. And then that gives you access to essentially product pages that are, first of all, accessible to all of the users that are on our platform. And that's, um, like several thousand designers and engineers browsing every day on the platform. So it gives you more
yeah,
exposure. But even more importantly, you have a conversation with the customer, and then you're able to send them, let's say, right away, the proof of the data that exists
yeah,
for that specific product, which we hear a lot from manufacturers that, it's been very, very useful in being able um, to win a customer, to better liaise with them, to sort of answer their question faster. So that's one use case that I really like because it really
yeah,
saves time for the manufacturers.
yeah, mm-hmm,
The other one, which is very interesting and definitely the clearer and simplest use case, is, as I said earlier, a lot of what we do is we onboard EPDs on the platform,
yeah,
and a very painful, let's say, exercise that people do with EPDs is that they are reported in a specific unit of measure. So a brick, for example, might be reported in kilograms, and then you need to have the value, let's say, in meter squared of wall in which you're
mm,
using bricks. And you have thicknesses and you have volumes that you need to translate into that. But if you want to do that on an EPD, or let's say EPD by EPD, you need to essentially transfer data from complex tables into probably an Excel file and then figure out the densities and the calculations. And we all do mistakes there. And especially architects, they're not that excited to do all of these calculations just to have an answer. And that's
right,
one of the very simple things that we are able to solve at scale on the platform because we are just able to say, you know, um, you can just create a selection of products and just convert them into the exact unit you want to. It takes literally like no time to do it. So that's a really nice example, which I like, and we keep hearing that is very, very useful.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, And that's not to say that, numbers are not an architect's game, because they very much are in many ways.
Of
But
course, yeah.
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it also just comes down to the fact that, you work as a team, and you don't want the thing you're trying to do, the way you're doing it, to get in the way. Like, at the end of the day, we're humans, and in a lot of
Mm.
ways, like, design is a very creative process, and to keep that state of mind where you're more focused on being able to drive better results in design and things like that is very important. So the last thing you want is to be bogged down by some kind of chart and table and things like that, where you have to, like, constantly context shift, right? This is a very common thing everyone's talking about now, is like, my context shift is constant, my context shift is, but
Mm.
like, and so that's what's very interesting there, is that, yeah, you can leave more time for things where the value truly gets more emphasized. So yeah, no, it's very exciting to kind of see this in practice, and yeah, we've got ways to go, for this adoption scale to kind of
Definitely, yeah.
happen that way to go in that sense. Um, but yeah, in terms of questions and so on, I'm still not seeing anyone say anything. We do have a way for us to do so. So for anyone here, if you would like to
Yeah.
answer a
And if
question,
not, I mean,
yeah.
this will be recorded. So in any case,
Oh yeah,
anything that sounded
yeah,
interesting and you want to pick up on, I'm sure that both of us are open to discussing it. So feel free to reach out to us directly on LinkedIn or on our emails. I think it's relatively easy to find those.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, that all that information is actually linked in the event chat page as well. What I find interesting, and I'm just realizing this now, that the color of this wall kind of matches the lower side of yours, and I'm just like, this was not
Ah, that is
coordinated,
true.
obviously. Yeah,
I'm actually
but
sitting on top of you.
right. So yeah, I mean, this is an upper floor. Actually, no one knows this yet, but yeah, there's like, Fanus is right up there. Cool.
Great.
Well, this was exciting. I'm
Yeah,
glad
really
we
nice
got
to
to
yeah,
share.
really nice to talk to
So
you,
sure.
Rami.
Yep.
And yeah, I hope it was interesting for the participants, and I'm sure it will be interesting for people who have a look at the recording.
Yep.
Thanks a
I hope
lot.
so too. Yep. Thanks, Fanus.
Thank you.
Well, yep. Well, for everyone else who joined, so far, thank you for being here. One thing I've been trying to do as well, this might be a series as things move forward. But the idea is that, resource sharing, I think, is very useful. And so this isn't sponsored by any means, actually. I'm personally kind of digging through and exploring and sourcing, more information, and just trying to match, how what it is that we're talking about suits the resource. So in the future, there will be more events planned, and the right resource will be linked to that. So I came across this recently, and I think it's very useful, to kind of look at, someone putting together who's very experienced in the industry, and having explored many tools. ADDD essentially is it actually, my understanding also in time is, we look at how talent acquisition happens, or how people look and find people, is that we're kind of shifting away from centralized job boards, and it's becoming more industry focused job boards, where, those interested in that particular niche or that particular sector can find platforms that are designed to, promote and attract people in those fields. So ADD kind of came up through in that sense, and I found a very interesting thing that they're doing. So over time, they've grown as well. And this resource here, seems very promising, as it really puts together very concisely, what it takes to design in this digital world that is very real, in terms of how we can amplify our value, and just cycles even in how we design things. So I highly advise people to check this report. And what I found out too is that they actually, Alistair has organized this so that it could be a workshop too. So I find that we learn a lot better when we do things in groups. So that might be a very interesting approach to do it as well. So definitely check it out. The URL is right there, add.io/GD. But yeah, so anyway, I thank you all for joining, and I look forward to hosting more interesting things. You can leave in the comments too if you think there's an interesting topic. I open it that way as well. But yeah, other than that, thank you all for being here, and until next time.